Excuse me. Thank you for taking the time to watch my presentation on financial well-being. This is my data science practicum for Regis University, summer of 2018. My name is Morgan Castanis. Quick overview of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to give you a project overview, talk about the financial well-being survey and the data that I used, the little data cleaning that I had to do, exploratory data analysis, cluster analysis, ANOVA and post hoc analysis, financial stability score and cluster comparison, and finally end with a conclusion. So quick project overview, as I mentioned, this is my data science practicum. I used R for all of my coding. Those are the packages I used, and you can find all of my code at the GitHub written there as well as posted on World Class. So, Financial Wellbeing Survey is a survey that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau conducted in 2016 with the goal of understanding what factors influence a person's financial well-being. Financial Wellbeing in America, the Financial Wellbeing in America report was released in September 2017, and then the data shortly thereafter in October. And this is a massive data set. Here are some of the examples of data items, but over 200 variables in the entire data set, and data items range from survey items, so how would you rate your level of agreement to this particular statement, to IRT, which is item response theory scores, and that basically says take a group of survey items together and weight some, and then create a score on the other end that says sort of a theming of survey items, if you will. And then finally panel data, which is, things like demographic information mainly, that it's just easier if it's attached to the end of the survey as opposed to having the respondents answer to it. So over 200 variables, I narrowed it down to 22 variables that I wanted to work with. I started with these three. I am satisfied with my life. I'm optimistic about my future. And if I work hard today, I'll be more successful in the future. I just thought it would be interesting to see if these that don't specifically talk about financial stability would be impacted at all or would have an impact on financial stability scores. Then I looked at some housing and living arrangements, savings information, earners, and who makes financial decisions, education levels, both of respondents' parents, of highest level of education in the household, as well as highest level of education for this respondent specifically. A ton of demographic information. Are they financially responsible for children? What's their primary employment status, age, generation, race, gender, ethnicity, household size, income, marital status, and census region. And then the last variable that I looked at is that FS score, or the financial stability score. This is my dependent variable. Everything else is an independent variable. I am very lucky. This data came very clean to begin with. The only thing that I had to do is remove these negative values or these very large values in 98 or 99. As I moved through exploratory data analysis and my cluster analysis, I recognized that these really threw off the models, and I wanted to just get rid of them. So we removed those, and that was it. Moving on to my exploratory data analysis, I started with just looking at the FS score, or the financial stability score. I used ggplot to make just a histogram here with a density layer over it. And I really am checking to see, is my data potentially normally distributed? I'm hoping it is, because I'd like to do an ANOVA test as I move forward, and looking if it turns out to be normally distributed. Next part of exploratory data analysis that I did is I just made individual graphs to look at the distribution of all of the independent variables themselves. So this is life satisfaction, and 7 equals strongly agree to the statement, 1 equals strongly disagree to the statement, and so you can see here that the majority of respondents definitely feel satisfied in their life. Next thing that I did was look at correlations amongst my independent variables, just to get an idea if there was anything that I would need to be aware of as I moved forward of potential things to cause issues. Definitely some correlations and slight correlations here. Life satisfaction and future optimism surprised me a little bit. Future optimism and the idea of working hard today equals future success correlated as well. And then things that didn't surprise me at all levels of education were correlated together, age and generation, those sorts of things. The last thing I did in exploratory data analysis is looked at histograms of the FS score overlaid with all of the independent variables themselves. So this is the FS score in the current housing situation. And one of the interesting things that I saw here is the higher FS score, which means they're more financially stable, the more likely you are to own your own home. As you get into those higher levels of FS scores, you see much more folks who own their own home than rent. So I was ready to move on to my cluster analysis. I decided to do a k-means for my cluster analysis, and I used the elbow method to determine what my value of k should be. Here's just my graph and my output here. I opted to go with a value of k of equals 8. Here's the output for my cluster analysis itself. Definitely something to note that my clusters are not fully evenly distributed, so I definitely kept that in mind. And then I didn't scale the data. I opted to round it to the whole numbers because I'm really using categorical data even though it is in a numeric form, and I needed to be able to identify within this cluster what does this number mean. And if I scaled it, I really just had, is this above the mean or below the mean? But that's really hard to understand if the mean is I own my own home. So once I had done my cluster analysis, I really just did exactly that. I looked at each individual cluster and I identified what number it was and created the real world words, if you will, of what that cluster is. So here's cluster 1. They have medium high levels of life satisfaction, future optimism, and the idea of work hard today equals future success. They've got bachelor's degree, millennial generations 25 to 34, Black non-Hispanic males with an income of $75,000 to $99,000 a year. Cluster 2, own their own home, live with a spouse or partner, $20,000 to $75,000 in their savings account, 2 earners in the household, bachelor's degree as well. These folks are retired in the boomer generation, 70 to 74, white non-Hispanic males with $75,000 to $99,000 a year in income. Cluster 3, medium to high levels of life satisfaction and future optimism. These folks are financially responsible for kids, employed part-time, less than $1,000 in their savings account, Gen Xers, 35 to 44 years of age, some college but not a degree, Black non-Hispanic female with an income of $30,000 to $39,000 a year. Cluster 4, these folks are Gen Xers as well, but they're a little bit older and 45 to 54 years of age, financially responsible for kids, white non-Hispanic males, some college but not a degree, with an income between $60,000 and $75,000 a year. Cluster 5, live with a spouse or partner. They have a savings between $20,000 and $75,000. 2 earners in the household. Gen Xers have a bachelor's degree, employed full-time, white non-Hispanic males with a household size of 3 with $100,000 to $150,000 a year in income. Cluster 6, medium to low and neutral levels of life satisfaction, future optimism, and work hard today equals future success. This is the first time that popped up, so that was interesting to note. Less than $100 in savings. Homemakers between 35 and 44 years, so Gen Xers, but on the younger side, with a GED or high school degree, Black non-Hispanic females with $20,000 to $29,000 in income a year. Cluster 7, medium to high levels of life satisfaction, retired again, 70 to 74 years age. These are pre-boomer generation folks, white non-Hispanic females with $30,000 to $39,000 a year. And finally, cluster 8. Again, we see these neutral to low level, medium to low levels of life satisfaction, future optimism. They own their own home with $5,000 to $19,000 in savings. Boomer generation, retired 62 to 69. They have some college but not a degree, white non-Hispanic males with $50,000 to $59,000 a year. So as I was going through this and creating these groups, I noticed that there were 3 variables that were consistent across all clusters. They all live with their spouse, partner, significant other. They have 2 earners in the household, and they all live in the South. So I went back to my EDA to look at these graphs to see what this means. So this is the living arrangement. 2 is that they live with a partner, spouse, or significant other. So that's not surprising. This is the number of earners. 2 is the number of earners. Again, the majority here, not super surprising. And then this is the census region. 3 is that South. So again, the majority of folks in the respondent group do live in the South. This one a little bit surprised me because while it is the majority that live in the South, it's not the vast majority. And so I was a little surprised to see that at least one other census region didn't pop up, but it didn't. So then I moved on to my ANOVA and my post-hoc testing. I appended my cluster groups onto the data, and I just did the FS score by clusters using an alpha of 0.05, a null hypothesis of all the cluster mean FS scores are the same, an alternative that they are not. I get a p-value of way less than my alpha and determine that reject my null and determine that the FS cluster financial stability scores means are different. I just threw in my QQ plot to make sure I have a valid ANOVA here, and I feel pretty solid with it. So then I went ahead and ran a post hoc. I ran Tukey HSD because what I really wanted to do is understand which clusters were different from each other and which were not. And I did find that some were not different from each other. So now I'll talk through those. Here we have clusters 1, 3, and 7, which were determined not to be different from each other. And I thought this one was a little bit interesting because there are definitely some similarities, but then there are some differences as well. But there's a lot of consistency within 2 of the groups, and then one slightly varies. And that which one varies, you can see sometimes it's 1, sometimes it's 7, sometimes it's 3. But for the most part, these have $1,000 to $5,000. They rent their own home. The age varies, generation varies, mostly employed part-time, mostly Black, non-Hispanic females, 3 members in the household with $30,000 to $39,000 in income, with the exception of cluster 1, which has that $75,000 to $99,000. Clusters 2 and 5, medium to high levels of life satisfaction and future optimism, own their own home, $20,000 to $75,000 in savings accounts. They both earn hold bachelor's degrees. White non-Hispanic males with the household size varies, but at least they both make at least $75,000 a year. And then cluster 6 and 8, I thought it was interesting that the 2 clusters that both had some neutral or low levels of life satisfaction and future optimism got clustered, or turned out to be not the financial stability score means were not different. So that was just an interesting thing in my brain. But about these clusters, a lot of variation here other than those things. They both they make below $60,000, but the race varies, gender varies, rent and own varies. A lot of variation here, except for that idea of the neutral to low level of life satisfaction, future optimism. So the last thing that I did was look at the actual mean FS score for each individual cluster and the mean FS score for the entire data set, as well as created some box plots just so I could really understand and visualize the spread of the data to see if anything interesting popped out here. One of the most interesting things that popped out is cluster 6 has the lowest average score of financial stability score of 41. Cluster 8 has the second lowest of 44. And you can see here in the box plot that cluster 6 in particular has the largest range of FS score, but definitely you can see that mean is down lower than the rest of them. So to bring it all together, clusters 1, 3, and 7 have the same mean. A mean of 50 is the overall FS score for financial stability score for the entire sample, or the entire data set. So when you look at them, there's a decent amount of variation in there. So I sort of think of this as a little bit of a random sample of the data set. Clusters 2 and 5, on the other hand, they have the largest amount in savings. They have bachelor's degrees. They're white, non-Hispanic males who are married. They have the highest earners and then the highest financial stability score. Cluster 4 have sort of medium level life satisfaction levels. They've got some college, Gen Xers with a household income $60,000 to $75,000 a year. And cluster 4 have a mean FS score of 44, so really sort of right in the middle of all the rest of them. And clusters 6 and 8, they have the lowest levels of life satisfaction, future optimism, future success. They work part-time or retired, 2 members in the household, some college or less, and they're the lowest earners and have the lowest FS score. So thank you very much for watching my presentation. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to answering your questions on World Class.